Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next Future Leaders Group training session, lunchtime training session. Thank you for joining this call today. Just to give you a bit of a background, the Future Leaders Group is a collection of individuals who are interested in open technology, open source software, hardware, and data. And it includes a wide range of people across technology, IP, outsourcing, procurement, data, technology, innovation, and private practice lawyers and in-house counsel. We operate underneath the OpenUK Legal and Policy Committee to try and bring together future leaders in legal and policy matters and to support the mission of the Legal Policy Committee. My name is Rob Grinnells, and I'm a co-chair along with Katie Gibson of the Future Leaders Group. We're both lawyers on technology and commercial. I'd just like to hand over to Amanda to introduce our guest for today.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back at the end of the week, which we were all just saying has been an incredibly busy week for a holiday weekend for most of us, I think, whether we're in the UK, the US, or elsewhere. So Sami Atabani is our speaker today. A great way to end the week. Sami is a long-standing contributor to the legal community in open source and a real expert in open chain. He's one of the main drivers, not just in the UK, but internationally in open chain, and has contributed a huge amount to the project. Sami, with that, I'm going to hand over to you and look forward to your talk.
Hello, hi. Yes, thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Rob. Yes, my name is Sami Atabani, and I am the third-party IP director at ARM. And as Amanda mentioned, I do sort of contribute to a number of projects and initiatives, both as an ARM employee and on a personal capacity. For OpenUK, I'm currently dedicating some of my own time, such as giving this talk today. A little bit of background on myself. I am actually a hardware design engineer by training, believe it or not, many moons ago, and gradually moved into more customer-facing roles, ending up in commercial licensing for ARM, covering Asia Pac, Japan, and the US. Over a number of years. Before I actually started to engage in open source, as we were seeing more and more questions from our customers at the time, I sort of dug my hands into understanding open source to be able to answer customer queries. So as I said, the talk today I'm giving at a personal level, and I will be making the slides available to sort of under the CC license. One thing that is important that I should mention, I am not a qualified lawyer, but obviously over the years worked very, very closely with legal teams and with lawyers on a variety of projects such as OpenChain. So I'm a member of the OpenChain governing board and helped sort of on driving the initiative. Okay, and with that, I'll start. I think what we'll do, as I can't see the chat box, please file any questions there, and I'll take the questions at the end. Unless there is something urgent, then perhaps Amanda or Rob, you can just intervene and interrupt me to answer any urgent questions. Okay. Right. Before we start, I always like to start sort of with a bit of fun. You know, this is just an imaginary scenario that I'm sure many of you will sort of associate with and identify. Sort of, yes, I see this every day. So, a developer, an open source software developer, and a lawyer. The developer sort of identifies a piece of open source package and wonders, oh, can I sort of use this piece of open source? It is for our wacky AI product. And then he said, I better check with my lawyer because obviously I've been sort of trained and I understand that I shouldn't be using any intellectual property that I don't have the rights to use. So they go and talk to the lawyer and say, I have this bit of open source software that I would like to use in our product. Is that okay? The lawyer says, yes, Mr. Developer. What is the license exactly? And by the way, which product is this going into? Which of our products is it going to be redistributed in? It goes a conversation. Yeah, it is for our neural network product, and I think the open source, I think it's probably under maybe Apache. Lawyer says, okay, here we go again. Can you please go and check that? The lawyer says, I've just checked. I think, yes, it is Apache 2.0. So all well and good. And the lawyer says, okay, Apache is a whitelisted license according to our policy, but I would like to just extract the license and copyright notices so that we know which obligations we need to fulfill. You need to explain to me how you're using it and how it interacts with our products, and then we can make a determination and tell you what obligations, license obligations you'd need to fulfill. Okay, so the developer says, okay, I'll be back to you. Then sometimes later, it could be hours, it could be days. The developer comes back and says, okay, I am back now. And the lawyer says, okay, so do you have the license text and the copyright notices so that I can verify? And then the developer says, sort of, I have the copyright notices, but the license is GPL v2, but it says Apache on the project homepage. So I'm not sure which license applies. And then the lawyer says, okay, we need to do a bit more digging to understand which license applies. We can't just go ahead and approve it for use in the AI product. So very familiar, and those of you who work with developers, it's a very common scenario that you see. Some of us see on a daily basis, some of us see multiple times on a daily basis. A lot of time wasting because you're not sure what licenses apply to the piece of open source that you're bringing into your organization or into your company. Right. So with that in mind, I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit at a higher level as to why is open source license compliance critical? Well, actually, open source license is just like any other license. You need to be able to fulfill obligations. So if you are not able to fulfill obligations that are within the license, that could lead to you not actually having a license to that code because this is somebody else's IP that they're giving you permission to use. And in return, you're expected to fulfill the obligations as dictated by the license. Some of them, as we discussed previously, might be permissive licenses with very permissive obligations. Some are much more complex and require you to fulfill a sort of a set of obligations. So risking that sort of not having a license, it can be quite serious. And for many organizations, reputational damage is very critical. You know, if you work for a large organization and you're found to sort of to be using any IP without appropriate permissions, i.e., you don't have a license to do that, that could be a huge damage in the market. So the other thing that is worth saying about open source license compliance, it could have business implications. Very often, what we see is when we're licensing products, customers want to know what open source is incorporated into your product. And it is only reasonable that they ask you these questions. So because they themselves want to determine whether they're able to fulfill any obligation based on how they're going to use your product. So so why is it critical from a business perspective and the success of your business? Well, very often these negotiations, license negotiations, can take weeks and weeks, and if you're not able to answer what open source you're including in your product and what licenses apply and whether they are compatible with your product license, that could delay your negotiations and your ability to conclude business if you're in a commercial entity. The other thing that we see, engineering efficiency, the rate at which developers sort of develop products, they're always under very tight deadlines. If when they bring in open source into the organization, they're not able to identify what licenses apply, that will take a lot of time for them to dig and find out. Sometimes they have to go to the supplier or the vendor and ask these questions and wait for days before they're able to get the green light to go ahead and use a particular piece of software that they're interested in. So these are just not limited to that, but you can see why it is important to have that. And I always like to share this slide. There are a number of things that you need to think, not just for open source, but in general, when you're bringing in any third-party IP into your organization. There are a number of implications. We talked about the business implications, negotiations, and the customers want to know because they want to know that they're able to fulfill any obligations that might be imposed by certain licenses. There is another thing that is important to understand. When you're bringing in somebody else's IP and combining it with your own IP, you need to be able to actually address if there are any critical bugs, any security issues. You need to be able to provide support and maintenance and updates to address any of these issues. So there is a big risk in using IP that you haven't developed within your organization, and you need to assess how can I mitigate against that risk. Efficiency is something that I see I see sort of again and again in my early years working for ARM. What we used to have sort of each group managed its own particular way of using open source and other third-party IP. There was no visibility across the organization. If a piece of software already is used in the company and the lawyer has already reviewed the associated risk, there wasn't that cross-company visibility. So it's important to think about the efficiency when it comes to management of third-party IP that you bring into the organization. And I like to put this one sort of you know, managing third-party IP should not be about firefighting. You know, as I said, very often product releases and product development is under very tight schedules for release, and knowing and having a clear process of understanding what third-party IP you have within those products, you know, well in advance of any potential release is really critical, because you don't want to be doing reviews on the 12th hour to determine, is this okay to use? Do we have the right permissions to use the third-party IP? Now, sort of narrowing that down slightly, I think many of you probably have seen this before. I gave a number of talks, and a number of other organizations use a similar wheel. How sort of many organizations interact with open source specifically. On the consume side, it could be that it is you bring in open source from outside of your organization, and you're only using it for development, something like a compiler that you're using it to compile code, but actually your intent is never to distribute the compiler itself. You're just using it as a tool to build your product. Or it could be something that you are bringing into the company and combining it or incorporating it into your commercial product and then distributing that outside of your organization. So this is the consume side. And as we will see, different companies have different ways of managing this interaction with open source. Now, on the right-hand side, the collaborate is where perhaps your organizations contribute into open source projects that are managed by organizations such as the Linux Foundation. We talked about the Open Chain project. The Open Chain project itself is an initiative that is under the Linux Foundation umbrella, and it is a number of companies and organizations that contribute effort and IP in certain cases into that joint project. One example I like to give here, for example, with Open Chain, myself and another colleague of mine drove very hard to make all our training material available and contribute that to the Open Chain project, because we sort of realize that actually many other organizations are putting and doing similar effort in training of employees. And it's not unique to ARM as a company. So we donated that training material and contributed that into the Open Chain project. Again, that's many organizations interact with open projects. Many people contribute to projects such as the Linux kernel. This is your own IP that you are contributing under the open source license or under a CLA like the Google CLA. So that interaction on the collaborate side is how many organizations, some companies do the consume and the collaborate. Other organizations don't make any contributions. They just consume open source and or other third-party IP. That's their business model. They don't make any contributions. Then a slight distinction between the collaborate and create. It's very similar, where a company could be creating its own open source project and is providing the governance, such as hosting of that project, managing any contributions. That is the create side, where yes, you are creating that IP and open sourcing it as part of a project. So very similar to the collaborate, but sometimes you need to make that distinction depending on the type of company. So, for example, within ARM, we acknowledge that actually when you make contributions, the engineering effort is very different to if you are going to provide the governance structure when you create a project, because you have to put all the infrastructure in place. You have to put the resources and effort in managing contributions. You have to have a process by doing that. So the implications could be slightly different. And of course, there are many organizations who make contributions to open source projects and then bring them in and consume them and bundle them as package them as part of their product. So they have an interest, they make those contributions, and then they bring them back and consume them as part of their commercial offering of their products. Okay, so we're talking about, before we deep dive into Open Chain, one of the things that I always like to talk to people about is actually, when you're trying to establish any sort of open source license compliance process in your organization, you need to step back a little bit and set out the post and the goal of what you want to achieve. So in my sort of opinion, you can't just sort of in 3 days establish a process by which you provide that sort of good governance or good open source license compliance management. You need to step back and sort of think, what does it mean for my organization? And I think at a very high level, it is knowing what open source packages you are going to distribute in your software, knowing what licenses apply to the open source packages that you're distributing in your software, and more importantly, is to also have the ability to fulfill any obligations the open source licenses sort of require you to have. And again, I include in fulfilling open source license obligations, I include things like retaining copyright notices, including things like the copies of the licenses if required by the license itself, including sort of release of or making offers to provide the source code, includes checking the compatibility of licenses. So all of these are part of the ability to fulfill the obligations. These are the goals and the objectives of what or the pillars of what good open source license compliance mean. And of course, there's no point of just knowing what or having the ability to do that. You need to have a clear process by which you're able to establish and accomplish the three things above. This is really important, particularly if you are sort of in the early stages of trying to establish open source license compliance in your organization. And I know many of the listeners here today probably are in the process of trying to establish these good practices and processes in their organization. So again, think, what is it in your organization? What constitutes the open source license, good open source license compliance, and then work backwards from that to really accomplish that goal of having all these three pillars in your process. Okay, so that's what is open what good open source license compliance. You know, we have spoken about open chain. A number of you are involved in open chain, but I thought it is really important to just set out again at a high level, what is open chain? Well, open chain is a collaborative project which had this vision of establishing or building a license compliance across the supply chain, because a lot of if you look at the supply chain, when open source, as far as open source is concerned, open source get distributed and redistributed and redistributed as the technology is built across the supply chain. And building that trust and knowing that, okay, when you receive from your supplier open source, you know exactly which licenses apply and what obligations you have, makes it a lot quicker and easier for you to assess, is this okay to use? Do I need to do anything different? And then establish, when you package that open source with your own software and distribute to your own customers, you have a full understanding of the obligations that you need to fulfill, and are able to convey that license information to your customer or your partner that you're delivering your software to. So open chain is that's the vision, is that it really is just trying to build trust when it comes to open source license compliance across that supply chain, by providing a framework for the organizations to follow. Is just basically setting what you would expect in an organization that adheres to the specification that is defined by the Open Chain project. What framework or infrastructure or process you need to establish in your organization to be able to establish good open source license compliance. And of course, if you are a conformant to open chain, then the expectation is that the processes that you have in your organization would be similar or akin to the processes of another open chain organization that is in the supply chain. So offering that consistency across the supply chain. And again, I think, just talking about the history of open chain, it was actually during one of the Linux Foundation conferences where a group of us were chatting, and one of the lawyers at ARM at the time was talking to Dave Marr from Qualcomm and sort of said, well, I bet you do the same things when it comes to training, when it comes to sort of dealing with open source in your organization. And the discussion sort of led to, well, wouldn't it be great if we're doing similar things? Wouldn't it be great if we can all share what we're doing and establish a sort of a standard way of establishing good practices and good processes in our organization? And that's how open chain came into life. It took about a year or so in 2015 to establish the project and move it under the the Linux Foundation umbrella. Okay. Again, what did Open Chain do? Open Chain basically established a specification defining what an organization needs to do to have sort of to meet the requirements of the specification. So things like you have to have a policy, you have to have a process in place, your employees need to know what they need to do. You look at it from end to end, from when an employee or a developer brings in open source into the organization. Do they understand and do they know what they need to do to be able to fulfill the open source license compliance requirements? And of course, a big aspect of that sort of road to open chain conformance is really, do your employees or developers know what they need to do? Have they been trained? And if you look at the earlier versions of the open chain specification, there was a requirement that 85% of employees who interact with open source have to have a basic level of training and understand sort of license compliance, to know exactly what they need to do, to know who they need to contact in the organization if they have questions, to know what they need to do when they distribute the products at the end that includes open source. Do they have the copyright notices? Do they have copies of the licenses? Have they conveyed that information to the customer or the partner that they're working with? So really have that in mind. And of course, do you have the ability to audit and verify that your employees are following the processes that you've set out and adhere to the policies that you have defined? I've put this as an example because I feel sort of for many organizations, when they talk about policies, they mix the definition between what a policy is and what the process to adhere to that policy. I think generally, if you're defining a policy, you need to step back and look at what is it that you're trying to do. In terms of the open source of third-party IP, I think it could be something as simple as that your business as an organization, your business success in technology is very often dependent on your own organization being able to assert the IP rights, to monetize sort of the IP rights and license commercially. That's one simple example. But with the same token, because you expect as a result of you having these IP rights, with the same token, you'd expect that others that others will have similar rights to the IP that they create, and you need to respect that IP. So again, at the higher level, your policy can be as simple as that, and different organizations have different views as to what this should be, or if they want to have a separate open source specific policy versus sort of other commercial software or other freeware software that they bring into the organization. I personally think at a basic principle, that policy should be quite simple and basic, and it treats sort of the IP rights of everyone in the same way as you would expect your own to be respected in the community and in our industry. Um, uh, of course, the process of managing open source and other third-party IP and the compliance has to be, you have to document what you need to do. So for example, if you're expecting your engineers, when they bring in open source from outside of the organization, that they follow a specific approval process, that is clearly understood and documented for people to be able to sort of say, yeah, okay, I need to bring this, and here's what I need to do. I gave this Tpip Tracker example on many talks. This is something that I strongly believe that if you're asking the developers to adhere to a process, you need to make it easy for them to follow that process. If you're relying on them to use spreadsheets to capture what open source they're bringing into the organization and what licenses, that just doesn't scale. Not when many organizations have thousands of employees. The managing open source it need to be scalable to across your organization, and that automation and understanding what as a developer, what you need to do to follow the process set out by the company and to adhere to the policy that is set out by the company. You need to make it sort of possible for them to do that without spending hours and hours in getting that. So online tooling, again, I'll talk about my specific experience within ARM. We have what we refer to as the Tpip Tracker. This is an in-house tool, a workflow that we've used where employees can go and search and look at a particular piece of open source, see has it been approved previously, has it been approved for the product that I'm working on, and if it hasn't, can I request an extension for that approval so that I can use it in my product that I'm developing. So that automation is very important. Again, we talked about open source compliance. Very often there are very basic common things such as retaining copyright notices, such as providing copies of the applicable licenses when you distribute the open source incorporated in your software. These are key obligations that you need to do that. If you're asking your engineer or developer to compile this list manually, that's time consuming, and very often, if it's manual, is very prone to errors. So you need to look at that automation aspect. And yes, it's okay. You can start with having a manual process, and over time automate that. That's what you need to consider for your organization. How can I? That the objective is that at a press of a button, everything comes out, is spat out the other end. All the licenses, all the copyright notices. If I need to supply the RTL, I need or the actual sources. Uh, that all these things can be automated, but you might not be able to do that in day one. You need to think, what is the goal of this process, and start establishing these and dissecting them into chunks that you can start to automate to make it easier for your developers to follow. Education. I'm a very strong believer in education because in terms of your employees, educating them, why is license compliance important? Developers are actually very pragmatic, and once they understand why something is critical as a company, they will follow it. I mean, I certainly see it talking to engineers who prior to being to receiving training, they said, oh, well, this is really frustrating. Can't you do this for me? And you think, no, I can't do that for you, because actually I don't know what open source you're using in your product. You have to establish that. You have to do that. If you relied on me to do everything for you, this will take months and months, and very quickly I'll become the bottleneck. So it's important that that you educate your employees to understand why are we asking you to follow this process? Why is license compliance important? Because in doing that, they see it as something that is positive to do. I very often give the example. Well, actually, if I'm negotiating a multi-million contract with a customer, and the customer won't sign that agreement unless they know what open source components are included in their distribution, that's directly impacting the salary that I'm paid, the salary the developer is paid, because we can't conclude business. So it's important to give them the explanation as to why it is and what the potential damage is. Again, when I talk about license compliance, I explain to them, well, actually, there are cases where if you're found not to have fulfilled all the obligations, that could lead to litigation, that could be seen as very damaging. Particularly, a lot of companies in technology are reliant on licensing their IP. So if you're found not to respect the IP of others, that could be quite damaging to the success of your company. The other thing I would say at a company-wide level is make it clear at a company-wide level who is responsible for what. Very often people come to me and say, well, why can't this be done by the lawyer? Well, actually, no, that's not the lawyer's job. Actually, you're releasing the product. Therefore, the lawyer's job is to advise you on what you need to do, and then you need to follow those steps as part of your product development and product release. And of course, one of the key aspects of training is, where do I find information? And it's important to sort of have consistency in the messaging that you're giving across the organization. I think when we did the ARM conformance last August, when we announced the ARM conformance, I talked about training of over 5,000 ARM employees who had to complete mandatory training that gives them sort of all the aspects of the basics of IP law, the why license compliance is important, and where to find information, and what are the processes that they need to follow if they use open source. So I sort of give this example of actually going deep diving into a bit more detail how you you establish conformance with open chain. You need to look at actually this is a copy of the specification, the open chain specification, something I looked at in 2017 for ARM, and looked at, okay, what you know, which aspects do we believe that we fulfill and we have in day one. Yes, we had different processes. We have the policy clearly defined. Everybody across the organization signed up to that policy. Some of the things were done better in parts of the organization, but not others. So you need to look at the aspects of the specification and assess, almost rank them as to can we meet those. And one of the things that we did over time is that started to build and reassess. So which ones do we have? And again, I give this as the example from ARM. So excuse me. It took us almost a year to to make sure that actually we have those components of the specification and we fulfill those components of the specification as an organization. And again, that does not, and you should not see it as a negative, because what very often happens is that you might have one part of your company that is very good at being trained and have a clear process, but you need to look at it holistically across the organization. You know, where do we stand as an organization? Certainly, that's the approach that we have taken as a company. Of course, if you decide you want to dissect it into slightly smaller chunks, you can say, okay, I want the open chain conformance for this particular program. So perhaps it's a particular set of products or programs that you are releasing, that you want them to be conformant. That can be done, but you need to look at it across the board. Is that whole group fully trained? Do they understand what is required to accomplish all the aspects of the open chain specification? In the case of ARM, that 85% was a real struggle, because we were doing quite a lot of individual training to the individual groups, but actually it was never tracked. So it was very difficult to evidence that everybody, or 85% of the employees who interact with open source were adequately trained. So what we did is we actually established the training, created training material that can be done online, where you can push it out across the 5,000 employees and assess who has completed that training and who hasn't. And it included things such as having a quiz at the end of it, so to verify and validate the understanding of employees of the basics of the training that they've received. And then obviously in August last year, we were able to sort of say, yeah, we fulfilled all the aspects of the specification in terms of the specification 1.2 at the time, that we were able to certify our conformance. So to sort of summarize, what does success look like? It really basic things such as, do you have a clear policy? Do you have a process for managing third-party IP, including open source? Can you automate or partially automate the license compliance and tracking of where open source is used in your products? And is there a well understood governance structure? So one of the key things, for example, in the open chain specification, there is a requirement that if somebody believes that your organization is not compliant with the specific license, that there is a way for them to report that to you and ask questions as to why is this, and maybe they misread or misunderstood, or maybe they did not find the information that they were seeking, such as copyright notices or license copies of the applicable licenses, or maybe even if it is a copyleft license, maybe they would like to have sort of copies of the actual source. You need to provide that sort of process by which they can contact you. And education, as I said, and again, I continue to reiterate, the education aspect is really critical for any organization, because that way it's not a specific group, it's not a one man or a couple of people trying to establish the good license compliance. It is actually collectively your organization is establishing that. So, and just to summarize the earlier slide, it's actually you do that by establishing that clarity. For example, many organizations started to have this concept of an open source program office, or OSPO as it's often referred to. That provides clarity as to if you need to adjust your processes, if you need to sort of establish better clarity, if you want to improve on your processes. The responsibility is quite clear, and that governance is quite clear across your organization. And this is something that we're seeing more and more of across many companies. Now, sorry. Now, remember my first sort of scenario that I have established. Now, let's go through that scenario again. The developer asks the lawyer whether they want to use a particular library from this open chain conformant project. The lawyer, of course, says, "Yeah, can you send me the SPDX file?" Because obviously it's open chain conformant. It means that the license information that is conveyed by that project is clearly understood, and is a mechanism by which you can convey that license information is available. SPDX is one example. And then the developer says, "Yeah, it's here," because obviously the project is well governed because it's open chain conformant, and gives the lawyer passes on the SPDX file. The lawyer says, "Okay, I'll get back to you in a bit." And remember my original scenario, which has a long time later. Yes, that is fine. It's whitelisted according to the company policy, and you can go ahead. You just need to raise the relevant approval record in our tool to record that you're using it for the particular product. And of course, the developer, because they understand the process well, they say, "Yeah, and I'll make sure that I attach the SPDX file, because that is part of the process that he needs to follow to obtain that approval." And then the lawyer can turn around and say, "Great, once you've done that, I will be able to seek business approval and complete it so that you can go ahead with your product development." And of course, that sort of both of them would be thinking, "Great, being open chain conformant makes my life a lot easier." Okay, so I've been chatting for quite some time now. So if we can just take questions and look at whether people have been posting any questions.
Thank you. There's not so many questions posted, but a bit of a discussion going on a few different points. Interestingly, the stuff you mentioned about the OSPO, the Open Source Program Office, we've actually been approached by a project out of Johns Hopkins, where the Linux Foundation obviously has a group called the To-Do Group, which deals with corporate OSPOs. But there are other sectors, so public sector / education, big universities, and interestingly for us, country organisations, where effectively they need to be OSPOs of a slightly different nature too. And they've approached us to look at the OpenUK model as being one for an OSPO for countries. So it's just interesting where all that work is going and how things like Open Chain feed into the whole picture.
Yeah, I mean that is actually a very good point. It's obviously you can take it at different levels, but for example, for academic institutions, yes, I would expect them to have their open source office or program office, but they probably the bit that they need assistance with very often is, how do I establish that? What do I need? What sort of mix of people do I need in that in that sort of program? And again, to just give examples, and this is something again I hear again and again. Within ARM, the open source office is probably about 25 people, volunteers from across the organization. These are sort of the very experienced, very passionate people who care about open source and care about open source compliance and development, and they are able to offer the guidance and the advice and establish the processes that are needed across. So yes, I would see that countrywide, it would be useful to have a set of, here's what you would expect. And of course, there's no one one size fits all, but you need to establish what the principles are. An open source program office is really to establish that level of expertise to provide the guidance and the advice to those who interact with open source and explain to them what they need to do.
It's sort of providing a framework as opposed to all the detail that sits under the framework to allow a level of flexibility, I think. Interestingly, Sami, and not unusually for these future leaders calls, a number of our people download afterwards because they can't make the particular day or time. And we end up with guests from all over the world. And today we have people from as far flung as the US and India. And one of the first questions comes from Jory Burson, who you may well know, I certainly know well, and is a future leader in open source in her own right. Jory, do you want to pop your video on, or do you want me to ask the question? If you don't pop on, I'll just assume you want me to ask. It's very early in the morning where Jory is. Okay, I'm assuming she wants me to ask. So she's asking about the open chain spec. Is SPDX required, or is the requirement just that you need to have an SBO form? I can't get that out. Sorry, SBO.
Yeah. Okay. No, it is not required. I think what we tried to with Open Chain, with the specification, the basic principle applies. You need to establish a way of communicating the license information, and that can be done in a variety of ways. You could just put a flat file that has all the list of licenses and the copyright notices. SPDX just makes it a lot easier for people. So again, it is much more practical. You have to think of it as perhaps as a lawyer or somebody in the business who's doing the review. If you receive lines and lines of licenses and multiple copies of the same license again and again, that will take a lot longer to review versus the SPDX, which is just an easy way of saying this package contains Apache, contains BSD, contains so that makes it a lot more efficient. So to answer your question, no. SPDX is just one example of establishing good practice compliance. It's gaining a lot of momentum, and I personally like it because, again, very often I'm reviewing somebody's use case. They say we want to use XYZ package, and if I have to read all the licenses again and again, that is time consuming. So I personally prefer the SPDX format because very quickly I can get back to the developer and say, yep, BSD, Apache, GPL, these are all fine. Or if I have a question, you have copyleft license here. Can you explain to me how you're using it? How does this interact with the code that you are combining it with? So again, it's just providing that efficiency.
Sami, one of the things that comes out of these conversations, and I don't know whether you'll know this or not, I remember being in a bar in 2010 in Boston and being with a chap called Rocket Esteban, who was the licensing lawyer at Motorola who specialized in open source, and his commercial client, John Ellis. And the whole SPDX concept was something they came up with, and they took that weekend to Jim Zemlin at the Linux Foundation. And their initial idea was that they would have a scanning ability. I don't know whether that's still something being pursued or not, but just incredible how these things.
The scanning tools are gaining huge momentum. I mean, we use Fossology, and I'm a great fan of Fossology. Because Fossology itself is an open source project, and also it sort of provides you with a sort of high degree of confidence when you do the scan. It's not an easy task. It is time consuming, and that's why when I talk about establishing automation in compliance, you have to think, what is my ultimate goal? My ultimate goal is to be able to download a package, scan it, and say, yeah, that's all fine. These are the licenses, and they're all fine in accordance to my policy. But that might not be practical because still many projects. There's one note in the chat. Well, many open source projects don't have the relevant notices, don't have the relevant licenses. My scenario that I gave at the beginning talks about, well, this project is under Apache. But when you deep dive into the package, you find out actually it isn't. There are other licenses in there. So again, there is a huge effort. So projects such as the Linux kernel, there's a big effort to have the SPDX identifiers on all the files. This is a big initiative because you have to think the Linux kernel has been developed over a number of years with many copyright holders. So you need to make sure that you're able to make those changes and tag the files. It's a huge effort that is ongoing. And there are a number of other projects that have the same. Again, when I talk about the collaborate or create, so for example, for ARM, any project that is created has to have the SPDX identifier on every single file, because we think that if you're using a scanning tool at the receiving end, then you can very quickly establish that, okay, these are the applicable licenses, and you can go and drill down and say, okay, these are the files that I'm interested in, and what are the applicable licenses. So this is why the OSPO is very critical, because they dictate and define what is a good practice and what is a good governance model for an open source project. Of course, we're not going to be able to change things overnight. But if we all start in our organizations establishing these good practices, over time, you would expect that a lot more projects will have the relevant license compliance information correctly implemented.
Yeah, and there's a slight follow-up, a short follow-up from Jory. I don't think you said this, so if you did and I've missed it, apologies, but she's asking if there are any tools that help you to create the SBOM, the SBOM.
Yes. So actually, a number of tools now allow you to create the SPDX files for your package. So Fossology is one of them. So you can actually sort of hit the create an SPDX file. Again, there's still a bit of manual effort that you need once you've created that compliance file to tweak it. And again, sort of as a company, I would say you need to start from somewhere. So if your license compliance file is not 100%, but at least you now established a process by which you're creating these, you can then work on improvements. Because in your next release, you might find ways of automating some of that information that you had to manually adjust.
It's interesting, all interesting stuff. I'm conscious that we're drawing towards time. I think it might, for the recording, Sami, be worth mentioning that Andrew Katz has flagged this week, and Andrew is doing our next session, as you'll hear more from Katie in a moment, that there will be an event on the 23rd of July, I think the afternoon of the 23rd of July, for Open Chain in the UK. And we're hoping that we will merge the next legal and policy group meeting into that event and invite the future leaders along to it too. So watch this space for more information on that. And if you're listening to the download, I hope you listen before the 23rd of July. And with that, thank you, Sami. I'm going to hand over to Katie to deal with the wrap up.
Yeah, and just to echo Amanda, thank you so much again, Sami, for your time. That was really, really interesting. Yeah, as Amanda said, we've got Andrew Katz talking about M&A and Open Chain next week. So do join if you're around then, and hopefully see you all then. Thank you.